Hello, hello! Greetings, everyone, and thanks for coming, and welcome to yet another exciting edition of Shoulda Had a D8, where we talk with digital creators from across the interweb and get into their minds and the machinations on how they deliver the amazing content that they bring for us every day. And this month, or I should say this phase, our phase one, we are focusing on creators who are part of the marginalized communities, such as people of color, queer communities, women, disabled, neurodivergent, and just giving them a platform and to explain how they do what they do and inspire others to do the same. So, some brief announcements before we get right into it and introduce my next guest is that we are currently in our charity stream. So if you look above and look below, you will see that we are raising money for the Trevor Project. The Trevor Project is an amazing foundation that raises money and supports LGBTQIA plus youth through suicide prevention, housing, counseling, and more. So we are currently $170 in. You guys are amazing. Thank you so much for the donations. Just the love, especially during this time of year, is just so nice to see. So if you can, please donate by clicking the button below, the donate button, and all proceeds, everything goes straight to the Trevor Foundation. So, with that being said, let's just move right over. I would like to introduce my next guest. It is my pleasure to speak with the legendary, the amazing, the brilliant Jeremy Cobb. So, why don't we move right on over and say hello?
Hello. Hello, everybody. Hi, I'm happy to be here. Thank you so much for having me, Omar. This is going to be, I'm really looking forward to this. This is going to be awesome.
Thank you so much for coming. Oh, I can't wait to just pick your brain and get right into this. I've been a fan of Three Black Halflings for a long time now, following you on Twitter, listening to your podcast, and I'm so glad I was able to get you onto the show.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. And yes, my brain is a field ripe to be picked. Please pick away.
Okay. Oh, I will take that as an invitation and go right ahead. So, Jeremy, before we begin, let's just get a brief description on the things that you do and what you bring to the digital content creating community.
Okay, so probably I'm most well known as the resident DM and co-host for the show Three Black Halflings. We are a podcast, although we've been getting a little bit more and more into doing some videos with our YouTube channel, but we are primarily a podcast dealing primarily with Dungeons and Dragons and other TTRPGs, specifically focusing on diversity and inclusivity. We do interviews, we do GM and player tips, we talk about current events. It's a whole kind of variety show, and then we also do actual play. Actual play series will make an effort to try and follow through with those themes of diversity and inclusivity in terms of who we cast and the kinds of worlds that we create. So, for example, we're currently in the midst of releasing our series Tales of Wagadu, The Curse of the Spider Queen, which is in the Wagadu Chronicles setting. If you're not familiar with it, it's amazing. There's an Afro fantasy setting that is actually being spun off from an upcoming MMORPG that had a really, really successful Kickstarter back in 2020. We are the official actual play podcast of the Wagadu Chronicle setting, and it's got all sorts of. Essentially, the premise is: what if J.R.R. Tolkien, instead of trying to write a European mythology, like specifically for England, what if J.R.R. Tolkien was African, like sub-Saharan African, and decided, let's look at all the different mythologies of various peoples of sub-Saharan Africa and create like a unified mythology that we could all look at based on those themes and ideas and philosophies. So we're in the midst of that. What else? Oh, yes, I do professional DMing. I guest on things like this. I've DM'd for Wizards of the Coast a few times. I've guested on NADPOD. I've guested all sorts. Hopefully, we got some hopefully very exciting guesting opportunities coming up next year as well. But yeah, I'm all over the place these days.
Oh, that is so awesome. Oh my goodness. And What a fantastic world to build. We are definitely going to dive into that because I want to know how you that world, how you built that world, and all about it. Um, but first, I would like to pick your brain on exactly what started this. What made Jeremy want to just hop out and then just go into the interwebs and just become this amazing dungeon master slash creator.
Well, it pretty much just kind of happened. It started with me just playing D&D, and a friend of mine contacted me. I'd heard of Dungeons and Dragons. I'd always wanted to play it, but in high school I never really had an opportunity. I didn't live close to like any nerd stores. I didn't really know anybody who did play. So, and in college I'd only played I think one TTRPG, which was created by my friend. It's called Paradox Perfect. We've actually played it on our show a couple of times, but a friend of mine was like, "Hey, you want to play D&D?" He'd never played before. He had a buddy of his who ran the game for us. I loved it. It was just a one shot. And then my friend started DMing, and then I started DMing. And then shortly, like literally the day after I started DMing, this was back in 2019, I met Jasper, my co-host Jasper from Three Black Halflings. We were doing a play together, and the day after I started DMing was the first day of rehearsal. And I then, of course, brought D&D to the cast and got like the whole cast and a good chunk of the crew playing D&D. So we had a full campaign going throughout the course of the show. And then from there, Jasper and I stayed in contact, continued playing D&D together. And then during lockdown, Jasper actually had the idea from just going onto YouTube and typing in Black D&D that there was essentially a hole in the space, that there was a real lack of Black representation, black mainstream representation in D&D and TTRPGs in general. Because I think the only things that he saw was a one shot with Terry Crews, a Critical Role one shot that they did, and I think a Key and Peele sketch, and maybe like another sketch. That was pretty much all he was seeing. So he was like, why don't we, like you and I, we love to talk about D&D. Why don't we do a show? And we recorded an episode, and it was a disaster. And we were like, we need a third person for this. Maybe that'll work out. And Jasper happened to know someone from drama school that he just so happened to see on Facebook posted about D&D. And he's like, yes, we had another Black person. And so we drafted Unati originally, and Unati was there. We recorded then 2 episodes with Unati, and we were like, oh, now this is where it's at. Here we go. Now we're cooking. And so we just started producing episodes regularly, and it really was a confluence of I think a few different factors. One of them was we debuted in the summer of 2020, and as you might imagine, among left-leaning people, an all-Black podcast discussing diversity and Black issues and issues of racism in TTRPGs, debuting in the summer of 2020, kind of the perfect time for a show like that to hit. And we got noticed by a couple of big names and people who were connected to big names. One of the first ones was Rick Perry. He who does the miniatures and I believe the sets for Dimension 20. And he took notice of us, and through him we were able to get into contact with more people with that show, and it just sort of snowballed from there. And as far as the DMing goes, we decided we had never been in person. Like we didn't used to record in person for the first few months, and we still don't record in person most of the time, but I had literally never met Unati in person. And we were like, wait, we got to do something where all of us get together. So all of us went up to Manchester, and we were like, in order to celebrate, why don't we do a live stream of a TTRPG, of us playing D&D? And I was the most experienced DM, and I think both Jasper and Unati were like, why don't you do it? And I was like, yeah, okay. Because none of us had ever DM'd publicly like this. So it was like, I think all 3 of us were like, so I DM'd the session. The session went really, really well. We were like, we got to keep doing this. And it's just kind of gone from there to the point where now I am the official resident DM of Three Black Halflings. So that's really how it started.
Awesome. No, that is epic. And you definitely touched upon some points that I want to then touch upon in more in depth. You basically we're looking for anything like diversity in the TTRPG space, like typing Black D&D, and found relatively nothing, and filled that space, which is awesome. But with there being such a gap in there, what do you think do you think like there should be, as in like more, well, not much to say you should think there definitely should be more representation, but what do you think is holding like the community back from having more people of color running those type of scenarios and settings for the masses?
Ah, well, I think part of it is just the history of, I mean, obviously the history of TTRPGs and the history of Dungeons and Dragons are not exactly the same, but D&D is by far the biggest and, you know, the most famous. So, I mean, if we're just looking specifically even at D&D, the people creating the game were white, primarily white men. They then made the game with other white men in mind. I mean, there are quotes from Gary Gygax saying that he doesn't think women really like D&D and like TTRPGs, or at least not the kinds of TTRPGs he's making. So he wasn't even making the game with women in mind. So I think if you look in the history of the game, you can find a lot of material that is not particularly inviting to marginalized people, especially people of color and women. So I think that's a huge part of it, is just the history. And even when you think of the classic D&D player, especially if you're thinking like the 80s and 90s, you're thinking of a bunch of white dudes, often in a basement somewhere, or like a college dorm room. You're not usually thinking of what you would see now, where you have, yes, still the most famous people are white men in TTRPGs and D&D specifically, but you also have a number of people of color and women and queer people at the top. Even, of course, Jeremy Crawford, lead designer on 5th edition, and I think one D&D, is he's white, but he's also gay. So right off the bat, we already have more queer representation. But in terms of what's holding us back, I think part of it's the history. Part of it is the established leadership of, especially like a game like D&D. You're looking still at guys, mainly guys, who were in charge of the game or who were involved in the game 10, 15 years ago, or even 20 years ago. And I think until you see changes at the top, it's going to be a lot slower to implement those changes throughout the system. I think we've seen situations like that arise recently with the Hadozi controversy, where I think the version of the Hadozi that was published recently in Spelljammer, while clearly being an improvement over what they had in 3.5, still was probably not what you would have gotten if you had people of color designing that particular D&D race.
Right.
And of course, the fact that they're even changing the word race now in D&D, stuff like that. I think that's I think the fact that the people in charge have historically been white and continue to be white is what is holding it back. I think that there are tons of people of color and women and queer people who are like absolutely fantastic creators and who are making a name for themselves, but I think it's not an accident that when you look at the biggest D&D shows, you're typically looking at shows being run by white dudes.
Right, exactly. And like, and I personally can't say whether it's not because I feel like they're out there, they're searching, they want to make these shows, and I don't think that they're really given a platform or feel like they're welcome to walk onto the same stage as all these other creators who are generally white males, cis white males. And I do find that is a problem. And like for the whole point of this show exactly is that I really want people of color or people who are marginalized to just step out there and like create their own platform if they have to. It's kind of, if you have to just make your own show, make your own platform to show that there is a thirst, there is an interest to see different mindsets, different cultures represented in the things that we all love. We're all nerds. We're all just big nerds who just love to have fantasy world. That's like, we're like the same in that aspect. And so why kind of bottle ourselves in for one type of story when there's just a massive amount of stories, like the segue into this, like the story that you're creating in the world, in the Wagata Chronicles, is fantastic, and I would love to hear more information on that, because we see so much like the Tolkien-like experience, and as you had mentioned before, or stories where it's based in colonialism, and I would love to see a story like pretending, like let's say like African history, that's as if there was no colonists who came, and you can see how it grew and how vibrant and rich the history is. So,
Yeah.
so tell us a little bit more about that, the Chronicles, and how that
Yeah,
came to be.
so yeah, right off the bat, so the premise of the Wagadu Chronicles is that there is the upper realms, which is where everybody starts, and then there's the land of Wagadu, and people fall from the upper realms to Wagadu. Nobody knows how or why. All we know is that, to our knowledge, nobody has ever gotten back. And it looks like fall. It looks it's like shooting stars coming out of the sky, and it's like a giant egg that crash lands, and it cracks open, and then a person comes out covered in goo, and when you arrive in Wagadu, you lose all or most of your memories. So you don't really remember usually who you were in the upper realms, and as you and of course the Wagadians then surround you and they're like, oh yeah, we got to clean you off and teach you the ropes. And another big memories are a big part of the lore in Wagadu, and it's almost as if like the more experience points you gain, the more memories you regain of like your time in the upper realms. And what's another really interesting wrinkle is that sometimes the memories can be false or misleading, and you'll have two people who have drastically different memories of the same things. Like maybe say you and I both fell, and then both of us meet each other, and I'm like, I remember you. You were the bus driver at my school. And you were like, what? No, what are you talking about? You were my boss. We were corporate. And I'm like, what? And both of us have like a clear memory of each other, but the memories are completely conflicting. So that's one element. Another big thing with the Wagadu Chronicles is instead of races, you have lineages, which we haven't yet done an episode about it on Three Black Halflings, but I think lineages probably would have been a better choice than species for the change in D&D. But everybody is human officially, but you can be one of several lineages. So the lineages, some of them are roughly equivalent to D&D races. So you have the Ozyman, who are kind of similar to Genasi in that you can have like air, water, fire, earth, Ozyman, but like the lore surrounding them is completely different. It has nothing to do, I think it has anything to do with genies, for example. But you can have the Emere, who are kind of like elves. They are, and what's really interesting is, and let me see, I'm gonna see if I can pull this up, because there is, for anybody who is interested, there, you should absolutely look up the Wagadu Chronicles in general, but there is a free PDF called The Child and the Oath that has all of this lore information, as well as a whole bestiary and a pre-written adventure in Wagadu, so you can take a look at. But they actually based each lineage on specific cultures from specific regions. So, for example, the Emere take a lot of influence from the Yoruba people in Nigeria and West Africa. Let's see, I found it. Yes, the Ozyman take a lot of influence from the Fulani and Hausa people, who are both kind of the Sahel region, which is like the region just below the Sahara Desert. It's sort of like a transitional space between the deserts of the Sahara and then like the jungles of like Central Africa. It's like it's sort of like northwestern Africa, or the north part of Western Africa. Right. That's where like the Fulani and Hausa people are. There's the Ikaki, who are like people who have fish parts like on their heads, like they'll have like fish fins on their ears or octopus tentacles instead of hair. And there's the Iron Masters, who are part metal. Like they're people with like metallic blood and can create these incredible metal creations. Wow. There's the Lion Bloods, who are based on like the Zulu people from South Africa and can turn into big cats or even small cats, depending on which kind you are. There's the Swala, who take influence from like the Swahili people. Among others, and they have sort of like antelope. Well, you can pick. They can either be antelope, Cape buffalo, or like cow horns that they have been blessed with, and they are often herders. Like, so what's interesting is that the lineages all come with kind of a culture pre-written for them, but you can also easily break out of that culture. So it hits differently than like race in D&D, where it's like, oh, the orcs, they're all like this. Whereas this is like, oh yeah, this is your cultural heritage. And so this is why you happen to have these gifts. It's not like a genetic thing. It is literally like a magical spiritual thing that is being given to you. So that's a big part of it. Another huge part that I would be remiss if I did not mention is the philosophy about around violence and even morality in general. Morality in Wagadu tends to be much more gray. It's a more shades of gray, which I think is something that you find in a lot of African cultures, that it's less black and white, like this is automatically evil, this is automatically bad. Things will have layers and nuance to them. But in terms of violence, when it comes to getting natural resources, it is actually considered potentially disrespectful. It is considered wrong to kill animals for food. Instead, what you're supposed to do is defeat the animal. And then when you defeat the animal, the spirit who views the animal as kind of their children will show up and then be like, oh, thank you. You've bested my child. Thank you for not seriously harming them. Here's meat. And you just get straight up. So if you hunt an antelope, you say you trap the antelope, the antelope spirit will come along and be like, ah, good job. You trapped one of my children. Thank you for letting them go. Here's bundles of antelope meat and all the different parts that you would need. Here's the horns and the hooves and the hide. There you go. And you're like, oh, thanks. And so there's no real bloodshed required. And in fact, if you were to harm the antelope, then the antelope spirit might be like, yo, why are you hurting my children? And then you enter into a whole new set of negotiations. So like the whole cosmology of it, in terms of not just like different realms, but also like when we're looking at deities and pantheons, is dealt with completely differently. There are some cultures, also ancestors. This is another thing. When you die in Wagadu, you come back as an ancestor. So you essentially, it's, I guess the emphasis is on the influence that previous generations have on current generations. So you can see ancestors from hundreds of years ago still there helping to advise or help along the current cultures of today. There's a lot of lore to Wagadu. I could go on about this for a very, very long time, but all of this is stuff that I did not write. I want to be very clear about that. That was created by the Wagadu team. So essentially what I'm doing, I'm writing stories that are taking place in this world. And actually they've been nice enough to there's I think a lineage that we created for this current season is going to be mentioned, at least in the upcoming source book that they're releasing, as well as some elements of like lore that we created for them. But essentially where I go about it, which I guess was your question, how I go about creating stuff for, is looking at what's in the book, and then looking at the characters that we're going to be playing with. So what kinds of stuff the actual players are bringing to the table, and then trying to build a story out of those characters that also jives with the world and interacts with the world and the rules of the world that has already been created.
Oh, that is so fantastic. I'm just like, this setting, it sounds so beautiful, and it's, you can already tell how rich the culture is. And like, I really would love to see that. Like, I'm so glad that you guys are doing this and running a story about this, because will open up the eyes of so many players on not being kind of pigeonholed or like tunnel vision into one like generic Dungeons and Dragons scenario. You can see that there's a rich cultures and vibrant settings that they can play in. And I love the fact that this story, the setting, has like the lineages and how you can create a custom character. You can still be human, but they're like it's not just, like you said before, not just orc is just one way and humans one way. You can make a completely diverse human that's different from another, let's say, human species character. And I think that sounds so exciting. Check it out, everybody. Definitely.
Yeah, the art, by the way, you mentioned vibrant and beautiful. The art for this is unreal.
Wow.
You ain't never seen fantasy black people like this. It's so like, just looking at it, it's like, oh man, like it makes you want to play it. Just looking at this art, and it's like, oh, these are people who look like me.
Exactly.
So, yeah, it's and even as you said with diversity, what I didn't even mention is that there's, in the rules, there are elements talking about how like certain cultures will mix. So you'll have what are called star cultures, which are combinations of multiple lineages who have come together, and like, yeah. And even within that, there's diversity written into each culture, where it's like some of them believe this or worship this person or have this relationship, with this particular supernatural entity, and others follow this way of doing things. So I think they really make an effort to try and promote uh, diversity and avoiding viewing any of these cultures as monoliths.
Oh yeah, totally. Oh man, that's fantastic. Yeah, definitely check it out. I'm already sold 100%, and we'll definitely be bringing that as much as I can to, or at least that style into the gameplay that I do, and hopefully telling others about it as well, which will kind of segue me to my next question. Is that so? There are a lot of people, especially a lot of people who, well, let me rephrase it. I know a lot of people who want to bring that type of diversity to their own campaign, especially people love homebrew. I'm always for homebrew, but you get inspired by all these books. What would be like a good way for someone maybe who is not part of the Black community or queer community to kind of involve this scenario, or take this diversity and put it into their game without like the thought of appropriating or anything like that?
Mm-hmm. Well, when it comes to Wagadu, like the Wagadu Chronicles, you can literally just run what's in the book. Like you
Mm-hmm.
can see what is written there and just try and run a story in that world. I think it's as simple as that when it comes to a pre-established setting like that. Whoopsie, just knocked over my water bottle,
Oh
but it's
no.
all good. I think I know that the creators of the Wagadu Chronicles want people of various races to play their game,
Mm-hmm.
and want them to explore and tell their stories in this space. They encourage it. And just because everyone is Black, it's like, well, look, yeah, your character's Black. Congratulations, your character in this world, you're all Black. Because ultimately, I don't think that being in our world, being a Black person carries with it a lot of
Mm-hmm.
baggage potentially. But I think the nice thing about Wagadu is that we're free of that because we never had colonialism. We never
Right.
had all this stuff.
Mm-hmm.
It's just people living their lives and they happen to have dark skin. And I think when it comes to issues of trying to be inclusive in like a homebrew setting, that gets a little bit trickier. I would say it is if you're trying to include a specific culture that is not your own, it is good to do research on
Yes.
that culture. I would
Yes.
say if you're going to have characters who are from a culture that is based on a real life culture that is not your own, you do not want to have their defining feature be, oh, they're that person from there. Say you have a character who's from a culture called Tablar. And say Tablar is based on Mongolia, like ancient Mongolia. You should not have the defining feature of all of these characters be, yes, they're the Tabarians. Or like, no, there should be more to the, like, they are people too. They should have the same kinds of experiences and wants and desires as everyone else. Now, it's fine to be like, oh, they happen to have certain cultural practices and values that are different. But from that, I would say it is very helpful to look at like actual stories and myths and legends that are told by those actual people, because I think from that you can see a lot of you can get more of their cultural values. Obviously, again, it can be difficult to try and tell this sort of thing sensitively. I would say the most experience that I've had with something like this is when we did our series Outlaws and Obelisks,
Mm-hmm.
which is based in Utarum, which is a setting that I actually did create, which is a post-apocalyptic North Africa inspired Western setting. And for that setting, I went to sensitivity consultants talking about like how best to approach not just the Western genre, but also the cultures that we're depicting. And I think the big thing was, yeah, try and have the people that you're depicting be people, and try and look at the actual stories that they tell, so that you're not just slapping a coat of paint on what you would normally be doing. So, for example, in the case of Northern Africa, one big story that was recommended to me was the Epic of Sanjata, which Sanjata was. If you've heard of Mansa Musa, Sanjata was actually a predecessor to Mansa Musa. I think he was his ancestor. Mansa Musa is a real life person who was the richest man possibly in history, but definitely in the world at the time. He bankrupted Egypt one time because he went on a journey to Mecca and gave out so many gifts that he accidentally caused the price of Egypt of gold in Egypt to plummet. And so this dude was so rich that he bankrupted a country because of tips. But if you look at the Epic of Sanjata, you can look at stories in there within that, because it's a series of episodes in his life, and draw from elements of that. I think that's one way of doing it. So essentially the answer is, do not approach this thing with a bunch of stereotypes. Do not have your characters be defined by their culture, or they're that person, so they have to be this way. Allow for the same level of diversity and personhood that you would allow for in any other culture. And then if you're looking to build things, I would say look at historical elements, how the actual people, like what happened to them historically, how they live historically, and also look at their stories and the stories that they tell, and try and draw from that. That would be my advice.
That is awesome. So we do something on here when we hear the truth spoken, we go snaps. So snaps to that, because 100%, yes, doing the research, it's such a good tip. It's like, don't shy away from it, but then don't approach it with like, I'm just gonna just pick some random thing that I've seen stereotype on the internet and to say that. Like, doing your research, going through the sensitivity training as you had said, and learning about it and presenting it as a real life culture and not just a stereotype that you have heard, is totally, that was amazing advice. Thank you so much. Yes.
Thank you. I do want to add, it actually can be useful to look up what perhaps negative stereotypes of a specific culture are, because you may not even realize which ones you hold. And so you can be like, yes, I'm going to specifically avoid this. So that you can be aware of it. Because look, if you are not, as Black people, we know if you do not have to deal with the problem, it's real easy to not notice it.
Right.
That's a huge part of where white privilege is coming from. It's just straight up ignorance, because they are not having to deal with these certain things. So it is good to recognize where the pitfalls are, so that you can then say, aha, yes. And if you have created something, you can then take a step back and be like, now, does this directly fall into any of the traps? That of negative portrayals, or say you were doing something Native American, am I doing like a noble savage trope here? Is that what's happening, or am I actually trying to deal with these people, these groups of people, in an honest and open way that is representative of the incredible diversity and the truth of their actual experiences?
Oh yeah, 100%. Yes. Amazing. That's something that I definitely would do more now, knowing that looking up and getting the stereotypes to avoid that, and also understanding where they come from and why they are negative stereotypes to better educate yourself, which is fantastic. If you're just joining us, I am interviewing and talking with the amazing and learned Jeremy Cobb, who you see on various shows, but one being Three Black Halflings, and we were just picking his brain and getting into the down and dirty on how he presents his content to the interwebs and all of us to absorb. So we're gonna moving on a little bit. I want to dive more into how you do you when it comes to bringing forth your content. So to start off, how do you approach like you're starting a new episode, or you're ready to bring your work to the internet? What kind of tools and things do you use to help you showcase your content?
Okay. Well, I usually I have this mic. I'm at a different location than I normally am, because normally the mic is hooked up to a whole arm and everything. But today we're holding the mic today. But it's, I would say, even just a regular, especially if you're just starting out, just like a regular snowball mic is okay to start with. You probably want to get something like better than like a snowball eventually, but I also use Audacity to record stuff when I'm recording locally. When we started out with Three Black Halflings, we recorded all the tracks locally through Zoom. Like everybody, we would be talking through Zoom, and then all of us would have our own, usually Audacity, open, recording separately. Eventually, we moved to Zencaster, which is a website that allows you to record not just individually through your computer, but also record an already synced audio on that particular website that you can then download and use. Zencaster, I know, is used by a lot of different people. We eventually stopped because we had a couple of instances of Zencaster. Zencaster got, like, I don't know if I had the hiccups or what, but there were some instances where we were like, Zencaster, you've done us dirty too many times. So we then moved on to Riverside is the main thing that we use these days. Riverside, I think, is more expensive. So especially if you're starting out, I don't know if it's what I would recommend, but Riverside records both audio and video, and is, I think, ultimately a more reliable recording source, although even it can hiccup at times. So that's one thing in terms of just the technical aspect of it. And I want to be clear, I'm not a super technically minded guy. So if you're asking me about like gear and all the different things like that, I'm not the person to talk to. But we would usually, we would record that way. And when it comes to topics, we would usually look at what is currently happening, or maybe if it's we have a series going on right now called Running the Gauntlet, where we've created characters that are basically showing how different builds can work through D&D in like a combat scenario. We do deep dives into various classes and subclasses in the game. We will talk about current events. We do interviews with people. So it's like topic, recording, and then we if you are going to go about releasing a podcast, it can be extremely helpful, I would say in most cases vital, to have a consistent release schedule that you stick to. So for us, our talk show episodes go out Mondays every week, and then our actual play episodes go out Thursdays. And that's not every single week. It's only when we have actual play to release. We were fortunate enough to be picked up by HeadGum, the podcasting network HeadGum, and they have hooked us up with some incredibly gifted audio editors, Daniel Ramos and Seth Lue. Daniel, actually, shout out to Daniel. Daniel hopefully is popping out the bubbly, because he was a sound editor on the game God of War Ragnarok. In fact, the past two God of Wars. So obviously God of War cleaned up at the Video Game Awards. I think that means technically Daniel has won a video game award. So
nice.
Yeah. So that's the team that tends to work on our actual play stuff. So if it's actual play, once we record the episode, we throw it over to them, and oftentimes I will give notes about like, oh, at this part, can we have a little bit of music for this, or can you edit this bit out, or adjust, like put some effects on here, that sort of thing. And then also for the talk show episodes, actually, Daniel, I think, will often go in and just make sure all the levels are good, clean up all the audio, that sort of stuff. So we have been fortunate enough to have folks who can do that for us these days. We didn't have that when we first started. When we first started, it was Jasper who handled it, and I think most of that was making sure the audios were in sync and everyone was audible, because honestly, that is all you need at first. And for some shows, that's all you ever need. But if it's a podcast, people need to be able to hear you, and they need to be able to understand what you're saying, and it needs to be not actively unpleasant to hear you speak. So those were the things. In terms of like, once we then finish that, we will often tweet about episodes. We have a Discord, a vibrant Discord, that we will often like make announcements on, like, oh, we have such and such a thing on. Sometimes we will ask our fans. We have a channel where fans can ask us questions, so we'll do Q&A episodes from time to time. I'm trying to think what would be the next step, I would say, in your question that I should address.
Oh, no, just more like, so you answered that and then some. So fantastic, giving the tips and tricks on how to get started and how to continue to get started. But I guess the next step would be, how do you continue to make sure you are consistent? And they're like, everyone has like their little inner saboteur when they're like, I don't feel like it today, or more so like they lose that energy, that drive. How do you keep that going and make sure you are honest with yourself and keep yourself strict enough to be on a schedule, like a release schedule you said before?
Yeah, for us, I think it really helps that there's 3 of us. And also, I have to shout out Jasper's fiance, Jade, who has helped a lot throughout the show, but especially towards the beginning of the show was hugely instrumental. And also our friends of the show slash 3BH Avengers, Joan Miller and Navar. I keep I keep forgetting. I keep getting Navarre's last name wrong. But Navarre of Secret Nerd Podcast, which is another show you should absolutely check out. It's Navarre does interviews similar to this with creators of diverse backgrounds. He's an excellent interviewer. He's been on our show a few times. But both Navarre and Joan will help fill in if some of us cannot be there for a recording. But for us, what has been helpful the most is setting a specific day of each week where we all set this day aside, where unless there's like seriously extenuating circumstances, we are all going to be available to record stuff. We have a group chat where we will be throwing out ideas back and forth. And I think the fact that it's not just one person, and that if I'm just getting burned out, Jasper and Liv, which Unati left the show last year, so our new halfling, not really new because she's been with the show for almost a year at this point, is Liv. And Liv or Jasper can jump in and be like, I have ideas. When can we record next? That sort of thing. So I would say setting things that are consistent for yourself, that is just like, you don't even have to think about it. It's not really a matter of motivation. It's just like, oh yes, this is what I do this day. On this particular day, at one point it was Fridays when we first started. It's like, oh yes, Friday afternoons, that is when I do 3 Black Halflings. Then we moved it to Wednesdays. And it's like, okay, Wednesday afternoons, yes, 3 Black Halflings. And sometimes it would be like Wednesdays and Fridays. Wednesdays is actual play. Fridays is talk show. There we go. Like that's just all. So you don't even have to really force yourself. It's just like, oh yes, I have this marked in my calendar. I know that I'm doing this day. I think that makes it much easier to stay consistent. Also, once people start engaging with what you're creating, I think that creates a motivation, because you're like, oh, well, I know people out there who are expecting me to do this thing. And they're engaging with it. And I get positive feedback now from this show that I'm making. I think that the fans provide a huge amount of motivation as well. And then also just the fact that we're with HeadGum, and it's like, well, you are contractually obligated to deliver us an episode, and you have sponsors who are expecting you to record an ad and deliver the episode on this day. And it's like, oh yes, well, we would be in breach of contract if we did not release this episode on time. So that I would say all of those factors have really helped us to avoid burnout. And the other big thing is just innovation. Never getting stuck in a rut of just doing the same thing over and over and over and over and over. I think as far as interviews go, each one of our interviews, even though there are questions that we consistently ask in every interview, the fact that we've had such a diverse slate of guests means that every interview feels really different and individual. So it's very fresh for us. And it's like, there's always, what new person can we get on? What new topic can we talk about that we haven't yet talked about? What is a new area of the game that we haven't talked about? The fact that we do current events, and it's also, by the way, not just D&D. We have so far only 2 episodes in this particular series talking about the fallout surrounding Ray Fisher, and to a lesser extent John Boyega, around the Justice League and Star Wars, where Ray Fisher had been essentially treated in a racist and an unfair way by Warner Brothers and Joss Whedon in particular. And of course, episode 1 was talking about the initial controversy, and then when it came out, all the stuff about Joss Whedon came out the following year. We came back with a follow-up episode talking about that stuff. We've talked about Black Panther. It's just about staying open to things and trying out new formats. We were coming out with a couple of actual play shows. We'll come out with a bunch of actual play shows next year, but several of them in particular are either games that we've never played, people that we've never played with, or even experimenting with the form in some ways. We got some really cool, more ambitious in terms of stylistically ambitious seasons coming up next year as well.
Awesome. That's all amazing. It's inspiring, for real. And great advice. Thank you so much for that. So you have worked with a lot of big names out there. You've worked with Matt Mercer. You worked with the Wizards of the Coast, Dungeons and Dragons official social media and podcast, as well as Brennan Lee Mulligan. How I have a 2-part question. One, how was it like the experience working with them, with all these big names? And what advice would you have for people who also want to see if they can get in contact with these creators?
Number 1, it was incredible. Or to quote Brennan, incredible. It was like I've said this before, but I wouldn't even call it a dream come true because I didn't consider it a possibility.
Wow.
Like, you have to dream it before it can be a dream come true. This I had not even dreamt of being a possibility.
Wow.
So the fact that like Rick Perry listens to our show. Oh, I never thought Rick Perry would know I existed. And then from there, we got Lou Wilson on the show. Oh my gosh! Like, and it is really surreal when you interview somebody that you've been listening to, like for like years. Because I'd been watching Dimension 20 since 2018 by that point, and we had Lou on in the fall of 2020. So it's like I've been watching this dude for like 2 years. Like, what on earth? The wildest one is when we had. I mean, it was probably the wildest because it was the person I'd been engaging with the longest. We had Jake. Whenever we've had people from College Humor, I've been watching College Humor videos since 2008.
Yeah,
and Jake has been with the company since back then. So and like when we had Murph on, like I remember when Murph started appearing in College Humor videos, and I remember watching him and Emily making videos together, and obviously Jake with Jake and Amir and all the different Hardly Workings. So it is surreal to meet and interact with people. It's like, I've been a fan of you since I was a teenager, and now you're just talking to me like I'm a person, and you're just a person. How is this possible? So that was like. That was the surreal part when Shelly and Greg were like, hey, do you want to come on Dragon Talk? We were like, how is this possible? Like we just started out. They've had Matthew Lillard, they've had Matt Mercer, they've had all these people, because at that point we hadn't even had those people on. So we were like, how is this possible? So I would say surreal, shocking, super exciting, and consistently really great. Like, those people have been very, very nice to work with, very easy to work with. It's just been wonderful, I would say. So in answer to part one, that is my answer. For part two, that's harder, because this is something that kind of fell into our laps a little bit. I would say my best advice is to start making something and start doing something in that arena. If you want to get big into D&D podcasting, the best way is by starting a D&D podcast.
Right.
Because then people can listen to it and say, I like this D&D podcast. I would be happy to interact with this person. Maybe I will let them know that I like their podcast. Or maybe you can be like, excuse me, person whose work I enjoy, would you like to be on my podcast? You can't ask somebody to collaborate with you if you have no body of work or nothing for them to collaborate with you on. So I think that's a big part of it, is just start making stuff. And every time you get an opportunity, be very nice. Be very nice and friendly and upbeat. Be on time. Be friendly to work with. Like, be easy to work with. Don't be like a complete pushover or anything like that. But certainly you want people to leave the experience saying, wow, I really liked that person. I really liked being on that show or collaborating or having that person on our show, because that will make them want to work with you again. And this is true in, a ton of fields. Certainly coming from acting, most actors are super nice for career reasons. even if they're not particularly nice people at their core, they have to at least act nice most of the time, because you want people to want to hire you.
Right.
So it's the same thing with TTRPGs. People are generally very, very nice. I would say that is one step. One step that kind of worked, I mentioned Joan Miller, who has worked with us a lot and does a lot of work with us these days. She, in fact, was instrumental in getting us set up at PAX Unplugged that I recently went to. We did our first ever live panel for 3 Black Halflings, and Joan was absolutely instrumental in getting that set up and then being a part of the panel herself. Joan essentially just heard our show, really liked it, and then kept messaging us, which, look, it doesn't always work out. I'm not advocating pestering people, but if you want to work with someone, it does not necessarily hurt, in the majority of cases, to just say, hey, this is a little bit about me. This is how I feel about your work. I love your work. I would love to collaborate with you at some point. You definitely get a big leg up if you have a body of work that you can refer to. So in Joan's case, she was like, I am a PhD candidate in fandom studies, and I'm interested in all these topics. And so when we look at that, we're like, ooh, that's really interesting. She's an academic. We don't usually have academics on our show, and the stuff that she's interested in are things that pertain to a lot of the things we're interested in. So we should absolutely, get in contact with her and see. And it still took several tries of her. Like, she messaged us. It's not like she kept pestering us at one source. It was like she messaged us on Twitter, and then I think she became a patron of the show on Patreon, and then messaged us on Patreon, and then maybe she had sent us an email. But like, none of them were like, as you would see in my other messages. It was all like, hey, just to let you know, I'm a big fan. And so theoretically, we could have just ignored her, and she would have just been like, well, too bad, at least I tried, and moved on, and we would have been like, oh yeah, that was that one person. So my advice is try reaching out to the people. Some people are more receptive to that than others, but it's worth at least a shot. The worst thing that can happen in the majority of cases is that they just don't respond. And it's like, all right, yeah, fine. And we move on. So I would say those two. And then if you do manage to get connections, foster those connections.
Right.
And hopefully those connections can lead to further connections. I actually just spoke when I was at PAX Unplugged. There have been two people that we have wanted on our show. Obviously, there's a bunch of people that we had on our list of guests that we wanted, but there are two names in particular. One of them was like the first name that was mentioned, and this was a very early addition to that list. Two people that we've been wanting to get on our show since we started, almost. And one of those people happened to be at PAX Unplugged. And after their panel, I went up to them and was like, hey, I'm with 3 Black Halflings. And they were like, oh, it's you guys. I've heard of you guys. And I'm like, yes. And they were like, all of my friends have been on your show. And I was like, yes, we keep asking your friends to tell you that we want you on our show. And so they were like, yeah, I'd love to. And then, so now we're in the process of setting up an interview with that person. But like, it was essentially that person knew who we were because we had connected with a bunch of people in their circle.
Right.
And so they were able to be like, oh, yes, I know all these people who speak very highly of you guys. I would love to collaborate with you. So it gave us more of an in. So that's that principle of treating people really well and then maintaining positive connections with them. And that can lead to, because we got to Lou Wilson through Rick Perry, which then led us to Brennan, because Brennan, I think, listened to our show possibly because Lou was on it. I know he tweeted about it when Lou was on the show. And then from there, I think he mentioned us to more people who mentioned us to more people who mentioned us to more people. And from that, it just sort of snowballed. But that is my advice. Hopefully that is helpful and reasonably achievable in most cases.
Oh, totally. The great advice. This is me like, got it. I'm just writing down some notes. Thank you. Got it. No, that's fantastic. Yeah. Making those connections, just reaching out, just having, because it can be daunting when you're like, I don't, in like this, like you were saying before, like these are holier than thou people that you grew up looking at, and all of a sudden, you realize they're people just like you, who want to talk to you too.
Yeah,
You just
it's
have to
wild,
let them
like
know.
how many there have been some really well-known people who it's like, you expect all of them to be just on it 100% of the time, and some of them are, but some of them are like really forgetful. They'll be like, oh, sorry, I forgot to respond to this, or I don't even check my email. Like, so I didn't. Like just a couple weeks ago, I'm looking at my Twitter messages and I see a message from a very big D&D name that we collabed with, and we had like scheduled this thing way in advance, and that person had just gotten it mixed up in their head and thought it was the next day. And so I'm messaging them like everyone else in the waiting room. I'm messaging the person like, hey, you on your way? And they're like, oh, was that today? Oh, sorry about that. And it's like, this person is a pro, and even they will make mistakes. So we really are, everybody's just people. The more people you meet that are in these positions, the more you realize, oh yeah, they're all just people. They make mistakes. They have issues and flaws and, all wants and desires and all that stuff, just like me.
Awesome. Great advice. So what are the things right now, that, if anything, that it's like a problem or an issue that you're facing and that you have to overcome, and how are you tackling it, or a problem that really was difficult, and how are you sorry about that, and how are you tackling that issue?
I think one of the most difficult things for us is busyness right now, because I think we've reached a level where we can push, like we've reached a level where it's like we have the option of coasting, or we can try and really double down and push to the next level in terms of, scope of success and who we're having on the show, and hopefully audience size. But it's been very difficult because we all have other things going on. We're all doing a lot of other stuff, and we're all trying to develop our own careers. And it's difficult when you're being pulled in all those different directions to get everyone's schedules in sync. It's like a D&D campaign at this point, trying to get everybody in sync for a D&D campaign. So I think that's a struggle that we've been having now for a few months, and we're in the process of navigating it. But it's about getting together and saying, hey, everybody, we all recognize that these are problems. What are maybe some solutions? Here are some suggestions that I have. Whether it's adding more people who are available to come on to stuff, or whether it's having a third party come in who can act as sort of a manager to say like, oh, hey everyone, just so you know, these are the dates that we're recording on, and play and running it a bit more like a business and taking it a bit more seriously. Because I mean, we do have a Patreon, folks are giving us money, so it is in some ways a professional venture. Like, it is technically a professional venture. So I think and we have sponsors as well. So it's about, I think, treating each other with respect and understanding, but also like trying to make sure that everybody's on the same page about where we're going with the show. And so that's kind of the challenge that we're facing right now, that we're sort of working to try and like, okay, so what does the next development of Three Black Halflings look like? And figuring out like what the model is. Well, when I was talking about the innovations that we're trying to do in some of the actual play stuff, or at least experiments, that's another part of it. Like looking at actual play shows and saying, okay, what is something that we've never seen another actual play show do? And that's not even just based on setting, but like say it's style, whether it's without spoiling too much, I'm trying to think of whether it's like having maybe multiple casts playing the same characters at different points in the characters' lives, and it's like, we're jumping through timelines, things like that, where it's like a different thing for the players and for the audiences, and the players have to then take on board the changes that the other players have created. And it's what happens when you have something like that. I don't know, other because again, I'm trying to avoid the actual ideas because we haven't released the series yet.
Yeah.
But it's things like that, just try to be like, hey, how can we push this further and give those who haven't even tried us out another reason to come and try, or people who are listening to another reason to keep listening and keep coming back.
Awesome. That's great. Great advice, and people can kind of use that for your own reference in your own life, to always like push the envelope, think of different things you could do, and those are so many good ideas starting off with. I'm not saying don't steal Jeremy's ideas and all that stuff, but you could totally use that as inspiration, which is fantastic. Amazing advice. Wow, I feel like if not the audience, I'm definitely learning so much from you. It's fantastic. So this is the point before we wrap up of the interview where I call this kind of our D&D corner, because at our core we are a Dungeons and Dragons actual play company, from podcasting to Twitch streams. So I like to get my guests to create for me, like in like a couple minutes, like a character that they have always wanted to do or wish to do, or something like that. And usually a lot of people don't play Dungeons and Dragons, they're not sure, so I help them through that, but you're an expert. So there's no need for that. But what's a character that you haven't played, like class and like species, class, and kind of like style, role playing style, that you probably would want to do? Anything that's floating in your brain?
Well, I think I've played every class at this point.
Okay.
Some of them I haven't played as much as I would really like to. I think Warlock and Sorcerer are two in particular that I'm like, I really want to try and explore these a little bit more.
Mhm.
So, let's think Sorcerer, because I think I'm intrigued by the idea of like a clockwork sorcerer. A clockwork soul sorcerer. I really like that idea of like probability and like order within the universe and being like, ah, yes, we'll make sure things are running correctly. Whether that's like we're trying to correct things so that like the timeline, say it's like, oh, I'm from the future and I've come back in time because I've noticed that there are changes, there are discrepancies being created in the timeline, and I'm here to set it all in order. And make sure that the future is able to happen the way that it was supposed to. Or maybe it's like a future Trunks thing where it's like something in the past went horribly wrong, and I'm here to set it right. And even if I don't get to live in that universe, maybe you will. I like that idea as well.
Oh, great.
So I would say Clockwork Soul Sorcerer off the bat. I would say race-wise or species, to use the current, the updated term. I would say species-wise, I might lean towards either Thri-kreen or Plasmoid. I'm also intrigued by the GIF, but I think Thri-kreen or Plasmoid are even more out there. For those of you who maybe are not familiar with those, Plasmoids are essentially ooze people.
Yeah.
And Thri-kreen are like insect people. So let's say, what do you think? A Thri-kreen from the future, a Thri-kreen Clockwork Soul Sorcerer from the future who has come back in time to try and like set right what was done. It may be, and maybe like, and I like the idea that it's like, I know or I suspect that this won't affect me, but at least it can be good for you guys. And maybe there's even the idea that they may not be able to, or they either they have a limited amount of time in this world, or maybe it's like when they come back in time, you end up with like a weird grandfather paradox where if they cause this change, they cease to exist. Like they're not sure what will happen to them, but they're willing to put themselves and their own lives on the line to try and save these other people and make sure that things turn out better. I like that idea. Do we need more?
Oh, no, that is amazing. You gave us a full backstory class and everything. No, I love it. Yeah, the funny thing about one of our Tail D20s cast members, we're doing a one shot on Sunday, a charity one shot for the Trevor Project, and he is playing a Clockwork Sorcerer. He just mentioned it in chat, so it's gonna be. I've never seen it played before. I've read it, so I'm quite excited to see the abilities in action. So yeah, that is an awesome class, and that backstory is awesome. I'm not trying to steal it or anything, but that might be used as an NPC backstory right there.
Oh, you totally have my permission to have an NPC pop in and be like, I'm from the future, and there's things are going horribly wrong, and I'm here to try and save it. Like I'm totally on board with you stealing that for an NPC.
Oh, that is fantastic. Oh man. All right, so it is that time. I feel like these interviews always end so soon. This was such a great chat.
We could have gone for another hour.
I know.
I'm here, man.
It is fantastic. Thank you so much for being on, Jeremy. I've had a blast, and I think we've learned so much from you, and from diversity, presenting diversity, and allowing that space to all the tips and tricks they can do to make a successful podcast, stream, and just being a digital content creator. So thank you so much. Is there anything, any final words of advice or anything you want to leave off to any of the viewers or any like up and coming content creators?
Yes, absolutely. I have two pieces of advice. Number one, don't be afraid to fail. So be willing to try stuff, because I think that's one of the biggest things. As I said, the biggest obstacle often is just people are afraid to even try at all. Don't be afraid to fail. At least try, because at least you have something you can point to that said, yes, I did make it. And also it's something you can learn from. If you do fail, any failures that happen, you can learn from them. But the other thing is, I would say be receptive to potentially being wrong. Be open to the possibility that what you are doing is wrong. And that's ultimately, I mean, when it comes to discussions of privilege, for example, like we were saying, if a person has not thought of something, it's like, oh no, like perhaps when you do research, if you're going to be incorporating another culture, maybe you already have based something on another culture, and this talk has inspired you to go do some research on that culture, and you're like, oh no, my depiction of these people has fallen into such and such stereotypes. Accept that has happened, and then you can try and fix it. You can take steps, and you can even say to the group, hey everybody, I realize that etc was wrong. So we're going to make the following changes to such and such, or in our case, say you're making a podcast and somebody comes in and says, hey, what you actually just said here was actually offensive. I know a good example actually would be Lizzo. In one of her songs, she used a word that is not offensive in the United States, but is very offensive in the UK. You can look it up. I'm not going to say it on here, but you can look it up. And Lizzo, upon hearing like, oh, hey, all these people actually found this word offensive, she's like, oh, man, if I had known that, I wouldn't have used the word in the first place. She just went back, re-recorded that line, and changed that line. Because it's a relatively small change, and a relatively small adjustment to make. So I would say things like that are, I would say, try and take criticism, as long as the criticism is being delivered in good faith, try and take it seriously and at least consider it and be open to the possibility that you might be wrong and there may be areas in which you can improve. And then improve. Congratulations. You may have had a small failure, but the important thing to focus on is your show is now better. So, or whatever it is you're making is now better. So it's ultimately a good thing to receive that kind of criticism that you can then learn from and adjust and get better at.
Awesome. Wow. That's, fantastic. So before we go, Jeremy, where can we find you and everything that you do?
You can find me on Twitter at Jeremy Cobb 1. That is Cobb with 2 B's and the number 1. The place that I am the most frequently seen is going to be 3 Black Halflings. You can find us on Twitter. Oh, and I'm also on Hive, although I don't usually use Hive much. I probably won't be using Hive much until Twitter collapses.
Right.
But I'm on Hive. I'm on Hive at Jeremy Cobb 1. Same thing. And we're 3 Black Halflings is at 3. That's the number 3 Black Halflings on both Twitter and Instagram and Hive. If you listen to us and you like what we do, you can find us on Patreon, patreon.com /TB Halflings. You can support us. You'll get access to like behind the scenes content, get access to bonus episodes, bonus interviews, all sorts of things. I actually just recorded one with Johnny Stanton. We had him on our show. Johnny Stanton's a really, really cool dude. He's a former player for the Cleveland Browns who's really big into D&D, super nice guy, also loves comic books. And so if you want to hear me and Johnny Stanton talk about comic books and how he would make an Aquaman movie for about an hour, go check that out. I don't know when it's going to release, but hopefully it'll be released soon. And then I also want to shout out, because I've never really plugged it. You should check out the show Warlock. Warlock is sort of an anime inspired. It's like basically taking D&D and trying to make an audio anime podcast about it. And it's a really fun show, and I'm on that. I play a sorcerer named Xander Corkstream. So if you want to hear, I am very much the little kid, the little prodigy kid who pushes up his glasses and gets the shing of light across them. And has a fro that's like larger than he is. So go check out Warlock, because it's a really good show. And I think I think that's all my plugs. For right now. Awesome.
We had Lauren who's on Warlock as well on yesterday. So it's an amazing show. I'm a big fan. So yes, please go check them out. We had 2 people now from there who says it's amazing. I say it's amazing. That's 3. It's amazing. Go check it out. So with that being said, that is a wrap on tonight's episode of Shoulda Had a D8. As always, you can catch everything A Tale of D20s at www.ataleofd20s.com, or you can follow us on the social webs at A Tale of D20s, and you'll see this VOD up on our YouTube, our website, and all the links that Jeremy and all of our guests have mentioned will be up there as well. So, from the first chapter to the last page, be kind to one another, spread love, and we will see you all next time. Goodbye, everybody.
Bye, everybody.